They gave me a number before they gave me a name, and for a long time I thought the number was all I had ever been. I was 9, not 9 years old, just 9. The chevron was burned into the soft skin behind my left ear when I was small enough that I do not remember the burning, only the smell, which has come back to me every time since in the bad hours before sleep. Antiseptic and singed hair and something underneath both of those that I now know is the breath of an Escherine handler. They smell like wet copper and old paper. You learn that smell before you learn your own face. We were 6. 27 was the oldest. 12 was the smartest. 32 never stopped moving, even in sleep, like something inside him was always trying to get out. 66 laughed once a week on the schedule of her own private calendar, and it was a sound the rest of us listened for the way a man in a cell listens for keys. 4 was the baby. He had been brought up from the surface when he was still soft in the skull, and he flinched at any voice louder than a whisper. And me. I was 9, and what I was good at was watching. The academy was not on Earth. We knew that the way you know a thing without being told. The ceilings curved wrong. The light came from no source you could point at. Gravity sat heavier on your chest in the mornings, lighter at what they called night, and after a few years of that your bones start to argue with you about which way is down. There were no windows. There was a single corridor that ran the length of our wing, and at the end of it was a sealed iris door that opened only for the handlers. Beyond it twice, I saw a slice of black sky and a curve of something blue and slow, and I understood that we were above the world I had been born on, but only just. They called it the academy because that was the word they had read in our books. The Escherine are scrupulous about words. They had taken our language apart syllable by syllable when the occupation began and rebuilt it for their own mouths, and they used it back at us with the careful pride of a man showing you a clock he has fixed. They called the program a curriculum. They called the handlers instructors. They called the windowless white rooms classrooms. They called us students. They believed, I think, that if they used the right words, the thing they were doing to us would become a school. It was not a school, it was a forge. I should explain what the Escherine are, before I tell you what they did to us, because if you have never seen one up close, you will not understand why none of us tried to fight them with our hands until the very end. They came down 40 years before I was born. I have only the histories my grandfather wrote in the margins of a paperback he buried in a coffee tin, and the histories the handlers fed us as part of our lessons, and the histories you can piece together from what the older prisoners said in the rec hour before the rec hour was discontinued. Put together, it goes like this. The fleet arrived in the high orbit of every inhabited continent at once. The ships were not ships in any way we recognized. They were lattices, long and slow and patient, and they did not fire on us. They waited. After a year of waiting, every government on Earth had collapsed from the inside because the Escherine do not need guns to take a planet. They have something else. They have voices. An Escherine speaks, and the inside of your head turns into a room with the door open. I have felt it. I felt it the first time I was brought in for assessment, when I was small enough to fit in the handler's lap, and it was not pain, and it was not pleasure, and it was not even thought. It was the feeling of having my own opinions politely removed and set on a shelf where I could see them but not reach them. Then the handler asked me a question and I answered it truthfully, because there was no other answer in me. That is what they do. They speak, and you become the kind of creature that cannot lie to them. That is how they took Earth. Not with weapons, with interviews. By the time I was born, 3/4 of the species was already living under their administration. The other quarter was dead, or had gone feral in the high places the Escherine did not bother to visit. The administration was not cruel. That is the strange part. The Escherine are not cruel in the way a man is cruel. They are cruel in the way weather is cruel. They needed soldiers. Their own species cannot fight a ground war because they cannot tolerate the cognitive noise of close combat. So they took children from the cities and the camps, and they raised those children to be the hands of the Concordat in places the Concordat did not want to go. The academy was where they made those hands. There were 6 of us in our cohort because 6 was a number their researchers had decided was efficient, small enough to bond, large enough that the loss of one was not catastrophic. They told us this themselves. They believed in transparency. The handlers explained in our first year of lessons that the curriculum was designed to produce instruments of policy, not soldiers, not killers, instruments. The distinction mattered to them. A killer chooses. An instrument is used. I will not tell you everything they did to us in those years. Some of it is not the kind of thing you put into a story. Some of it I have forgotten on purpose, which is its own kind of survival. But I will tell you the shape of it because the shape is the thing. They taught us pain on a schedule. Tuesdays were what they called nociceptive calibration, which is a long word for being hurt until you stopped flinching at the smaller hurts. The room they used for it was small and clean, and the floor sloped a little toward a drain at the back. They strapped a sleeve onto your forearm and they ran a current through it, and the current rose every minute, and you sat there with your teeth set against your own tongue until the handler said stop. The handler said stop when he saw what he wanted to see in your face, not before. The point of the exercise was not the pain. The point was to teach you that the pain was not yours. The pain was a tool the handler used to make a change in you, and the change in you belonged to the handler. By the time I was 6, I could sit in that room for 20 minutes without my breathing rate changing. 12, who was Yusuf, could sit there for 30. Wednesdays were obedience drills. They were the dullest of the days. You stood in a line and you did what you were told, and they varied what they told you to do until they found the thing that broke the line. Sometimes it was a small thing. Stand on one foot. Repeat a phrase in their language until you stumbled on a syllable. Sometimes it was not small. Strike the person beside you. Keep striking. Do not stop until I tell you to stop. We learned in those drills that the trick was to be hit in a way that looked worse than it was. Marcus taught us. Marcus had taught himself, and on the Sundays we knew the line drill was coming on Wednesday. Marcus would walk us through the angles. Thursdays were what they called moral architecture, which was the part where they sat us in a circle and asked us hypothetical questions about loyalty and harm, and rewarded the answers that aligned with the Concordat's view of the universe. The questions had the shape of children's questions. If a stranger on the surface needed shelter and feeding, the stranger would cost you a week of rations. What would you do? If a member of your cohort failed a drill and the failure could be attributed to a different member, would you correct the record? If your handler was injured and the only available aid would require you to leave a task incomplete, would you provide the aid? The right answers by the curriculum's lights were the answers that put the operation first. The stranger goes hungry. The record stays as logged. The task gets finished. We gave the right answers. We had figured out the right answers by our second year. We gave them in a calm, flat voice, and the handlers wrote in their tablets, and the actual answers we were holding inside our heads went unrecorded. Fridays were combat. The drills were not what you would call combat in the old sense. There were no rifles because the Escherine did not yet trust us with rifles. There were sticks and there were padded gloves and there was a circle drawn on the floor, and there was the instruction every Friday morning that the lesson was to win. The lessons were 2-on-1 and then 3-on-1 and then 4-on-1. And then in our later years they were 1-on-1 against a handler-controlled drone that moved the way a body moves, and you fought the drone until either the drone stopped or you stopped. The drones did not stop on their own. The drones stopped when the handler told them to. The handler told them to stop when he saw what he wanted to see in your face. Again, the point was not the fighting. The point was the obedience inside the fighting. Saturdays were rest, which meant rest for the body and not for the mind, because Saturday was the day they spoke to us one at a time, in their own voices, and emptied us out and refilled us with what they wanted us to be. I have already tried to tell you what their voices feel like, and I have not done it well. I will try again. Imagine a man you have known your whole life walking into your house and opening every drawer and looking at everything inside the drawers, and then closing them again. He does not take anything. He does not move anything. But when he leaves, you go through the drawers and you find that the things inside them are arranged in a way you would not have arranged them, and you cannot put them back the way they were, because you cannot remember the way they were. That is the Saturday session. That is what it does to you. Over 6 years, over 300 Saturdays, the drawers inside your head are arranged by the man who keeps walking in. Sundays were free. We were allowed to talk to each other. We were watched, but we were allowed. Sundays were the only thing they got wrong. I want to talk about 27 now, because he was the one who started it, and because I do not want to forget him. 27 was tall and thin, and he had a way of looking at a problem like it had personally offended him. He had been at the academy 2 years longer than the rest of us. He had washed out of an earlier cohort, which is to say the other 5 of his cohort had not survived their final lesson, and the Concordat in its tidy way had simply slotted him in with us. He never spoke about the first 5. But on the first Sunday after I learned to read the handler's calendar tattoos, 27 leaned across the table and asked me what my name was. I told him I was 9. He shook his head. He said, "No, your name, the one your mother gave you." I did not have one. I told him so. I told him I had been brought up from the surface before I could speak, and that the records the handlers had shown me did not list a name, only an intake number from the camp where I had been born. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Fine, I will give you one." He called me Daniel. He did not say why. I asked him once and he said it was the name of a boy he had known on the surface who had been kind to him and who had not survived the intake. He said it like he was giving me something that had been worn around someone else's neck and was now mine. I took it. I did not tell the handlers. None of us told the handlers. By the end of that year, all 6 of us had names. 27 was Marcus, 12 was Yusuf, 32 who never stopped moving was Eli, 66 who laughed on her own private schedule was Hannah, 4 the baby was Sam, and I was Daniel. We did not use the names in front of the handlers. We did not even use them out loud most of the time, but we used them in our heads and we used them on Sundays, and after a while the names became more solid than the numbers. The numbers were what they called us. The names were what we called each other. There is a difference between those two things, and the Escherine, for all their study, did not understand it. They did not understand it because they have no names. They have functions and frequencies and ranks. Their language has no proper nouns. When they spoke to us, they used our numbers because to them, a number was the most precise way to identify a person. They had read in our books that humans named each other, but they understood nomming the way a man with no tongue understands singing. They had filed it under primitive ritual. They thought they had trained it out of us. They had not. The 3rd year was the year we lost Sam. Sam was small. He had always been small. He had come up from the surface late and the early years of the curriculum had not gone well for him. He flinched. He cried at night, even though we were not supposed to cry, and the rest of us covered for him in shifts, taking turns sleeping near him, so that when the night handlers came through on rounds we could put a hand over his mouth without thinking. Marcus had told us in his 2nd Sunday that the night handlers logged any audible distress as a behavioral failure, and 3 behavioral failures in a week was grounds for what they called recalibration. None of us had ever come back from recalibration the same. There was a boy in the cohort beside ours, a boy with the number 30 on his ear, who had gone in laughing on Tuesday and come out on Friday unable to remember which of his hands was which. So we covered for Sam. We took the failures on our own records and absorbed the consequences, and we did this for 2.5 years. And for 2.5 years it worked. Then there was a Friday combat drill in the 3rd year, and Sam froze. The drill was simple by their standards. 2 students in the circle, 1 stick. The instruction was to win. The handler watching the drill was the one we called Whisper because his voice was so soft you could only hear it inside your own skull. Whisper liked Sam. That was the worst part. Whisper had decided, somewhere in his strange, cool mind, that Sam was the most promising of us, because Sam was the one most easily moved. Whisper had been working on Sam for months in the Saturday sessions. He had been pouring something into Sam, slow and patient, and on that Friday morning he wanted to see what would come out. Sam was up against Eli, who never stopped moving. Eli had the stick. Sam had nothing. The handler had told them to fight. Sam stood in the middle of the circle and looked at Eli with his small, wet eyes, and he did not move. Eli looked back. Eli looked at Sam. Then Eli looked at Whisper. Then Eli, slow and clear, set the stick down on the floor of the circle and stepped back. Whisper went very still. The rest of us were watching from the benches. None of us breathed. The thing Eli had just done did not have a name in the curriculum. It was not refusal because refusal had a protocol and Eli had not followed it. It was not failure because failure had a protocol too. It was something else. It was a man putting down a tool because he did not want to use it. It was Sunday behavior on a Friday, and the Escherine had no file for it. Whisper called Eli forward. Whisper put his hand on Eli's chest, the way they did when they were about to speak directly. Eli did not flinch. I remember that. Eli, who had never been still in his life, was perfectly still under Whisper's hand, and Whisper spoke. We did not hear what he said. We never heard what they said in those moments. The frequencies they used were not for us, but we saw Eli's face change. We saw the muscles around Eli's mouth slacken. We saw his eyes find some point on the far wall and lock there. And then Eli walked back into the circle, picked up the stick and walked over to Sam. He killed Sam with the third strike. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment because if you have not lived in a place like the academy you may not understand. I did not feel rage. Rage was for Sundays. On Fridays we were trained out of rage. What I felt was something colder. I felt a kind of recognition. I understood, watching Eli's face, that this was the shape of what they wanted. They wanted us to be Eli in that moment. They wanted us to be a hand that closed when they told it to close. And I understood, with a clarity that has never left me, that if they got what they wanted they would use us against everyone we had ever loved. They would point us at the city still standing on the surface and they would speak, and we would close our hands. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We did not have to. The look went all the way through. That night Eli came back to the dorm. He did not cry. He did not speak. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, and his hands shook and his legs shook, and the whole length of him shook in long, slow waves, and none of us went at him because we knew he did not want to be touched. In the morning he sat up and ate his ration and went to his next class. By the end of the week he was moving again, the way he had always moved, like something inside him was trying to get out. But the something was different now. The something had teeth. On Sunday Eli said, "My name is Eli. I am Eli. I am Eli." He said it 3 times like he was making sure of it. Then he said Sam's name was Sam, and we all said it back. Sam's name was Sam. We did not forget Sam. The Escherine had a procedure for losses. The handler came in on Monday and informed us, in the soft, careful language of their administration, that 4 had failed his curriculum, and that the cohort would continue with 5 students. He did not say killed. He did not say murdered. He said failed. He said the word and waited for us to nod, and we nodded, because nodding was the protocol, and inside our heads we were saying Sam's name over and over so that the nod could not erase it. The handler watched us nod and went away satisfied. He had filed the loss correctly. He had observed the appropriate response. He believed the curriculum was proceeding. That was the first time I understood that we could lie to them. You have to understand what that meant. The Escherine voice opens you up. When they speak to you in their own register, in their own frequencies, you cannot lie. We had been told this all our lives, and we had felt it ourselves, and it was true. But the handler on that Monday morning had not spoken to us in his own voice. He had spoken to us in our language, in his ordinary administrative tone, and we had nodded, and inside our heads we had been somewhere he could not reach. The trick was not to lie to the voice. The trick was to stay quiet in the parts of us the voice could not see. We had a place to hide. Our names. The names we had given each other. The names were in a room inside our heads that the handlers had never opened, because the handlers did not know the room existed. I told Marcus that night. I told him in the dark, low and slow, with my mouth against the metal frame of his bunk so that the cameras would not catch the shape of my words. I said, "We can keep things from them." Marcus did not answer right away. Then he said, "I know." He had known longer than I had. He had been keeping a list. The list was inside Marcus's head because of course it was. Marcus had taught himself in the years before our cohort how to hold information in places the Escherine could not search. He had built a kind of locked room behind his eyes. In that room he kept the names: Sam, Daniel, Yusuf, Eli, Hannah, Marcus, and he kept other things too. He kept the layout of the wing. He kept the rotations of the handlers. He kept the number of doors between our dorm and the iris that led to the rest of the facility. He kept the faces of the boys and girls he had grown up with in his first cohort, the ones who had not survived their final lesson, and he kept what he thought their names had been, because he had not learned the names in time, and he was going to learn ours and remember them. He told me all of this on a Sunday in our fourth year, in a low voice in the corner of the rec room, with Hannah's laugh covering the sound. He told me because he had decided to trust me, and because he had decided that he was not going to make it through the curriculum, and because someone needed to know. I asked him what he meant by not going to make it. He said, "I am going to fail on purpose, on the final lesson." I asked him what the final lesson was. He said, "I do not know exactly, but I know what it is for." He told me, in that low voice, what he had pieced together over 6 years of watching. The curriculum was not for soldiers. The curriculum was for a particular kind of operation. The Escherine were preparing to move against a holdout on the surface, a region of the old continent that they had not yet been able to reach with their voices. The terrain in that region interfered with their frequencies. They needed instruments who could go in on foot without supervision and remove the leadership of the holdout. The final lesson was the test. The test was to prove that we could remove a target on command, without the handler's voice in our heads, from inside our own minds. If we passed, we would be deployed. If we failed, we would be recalibrated and used for parts. Marcus said, "I am going to fail." He said, "I am not going to be the thing that walks into the holdout and kills the last free people on the surface." He said, "I want you to fail with me." I said yes before I knew I had said it. The yes was already in me, the way the names were already in me, the way the room behind my eyes had been built without my noticing. I said yes, and Marcus put his hand on the back of my neck, the way a father puts his hand on his son, and he said, "Good." We told the others one by one over the next year. Yusuf first, because Yusuf was the smartest and we needed him to think through the failure modes. Then Hannah, because Hannah's laugh was the cover under which all our worst conversations took place. Then Eli last, because Eli had killed Sam, and we were not sure what Eli would do. Eli wept when we told him. He did not make a sound. The tears just came and he sat with them, and when they stopped he said, "I am with you. I have been with you. Sam was my brother. Sam's name was Sam. I will not do it again." We were 5, and we were going to fail together, and the Escherine did not know. The 6th year was the worst. The 6th year was when they brought in what they called the chair. The chair was in a room we had not seen before, off the main corridor, behind an iris door that opened only for the senior handlers. They took us into it one at a time, on Saturdays. The chair was a long flat thing that held you at the head and the wrists and the ankles, and there were no straps because the Escherine do not use restraints. They use voice. You lay down in the chair because the voice told you to lay down, and you stayed there because the voice told you to stay, and the senior handler stood at your head and spoke to you for an hour. I do not remember most of what was said to me in the chair. The memory is not there. It is like trying to remember the inside of a dream. I remember the ceiling, which was the same featureless white as every other ceiling in the academy. I remember the smell of the senior handler, which was the wet copper smell and something else, like ozone before a storm. I remember the moment when the voice opened the door inside my head, and I remember sitting in the room behind my eyes with the names, and listening to the voice move through the outer rooms looking for me. It did not find me. I do not know why it did not find me. I think it is because the Escherine had built their voice for a kind of mind they understood, and the room I was sitting in was a room they had not imagined a human could build. They had not imagined it because they had taught us, in our moral architecture classes, that the self was an illusion, that the individual was a temporary configuration of impulses, that names were primitive ritual. They had been so convinced of this, that they had never thought to look for a person sitting inside a person, holding a name like a candle. When the hour was over, I got up out of the chair. I walked back to the dorm. The senior handler logged me as receptive and progressing. He had no idea. I do remember pieces. Not whole sentences, but pieces. The senior handler in the chair was the one we called Whisper, the same one who had stood over Sam in the third year, and his voice in his own register was nothing like his voice in ours. It had a layered quality, a feeling of three things being said at once, and the three things did not always agree, and the disagreement was part of the technique. He was asking me to feel three things, and then to choose which of the three was most like me, and the choosing was supposed to lock me into a shape. I remember he asked me whether I had ever loved anyone. I remember the room behind my eyes going very still. I remember sitting in the room with Marcus's voice in my head, the way Marcus had said the name Daniel on the first Sunday, and I remember thinking, yes, I have loved someone, and you are not going to know who, and you are not going to know what loving was for. I remember the small, careful tilt of Whisper's head when the answer he was expecting did not come back. I remember the way he tried again, and on the third try gave up. I remember the smell of him close to my face, wet copper, ozone, and underneath both, something dry and old, like the inside of a book that had been left in the sun. I remember thinking, even then, that the smell was the smell of a thing that had been studying us for a long time, and had not learned the one thing it needed to learn. We compared notes on Sunday. All five of us had hidden. All five of us had kept our names. We sat in the rec room and we laughed, very softly, under Hannah's cover laugh, and for the first time in 6 years I felt something close to joy. The final lesson was scheduled for the end of the 7th year. They told us the date a month in advance, the way they told us everything, with the soft, careful language of a school telling its seniors when graduation would be held. They told us that on the morning of the final lesson, we would be brought to the central chamber. They told us that we would be presented with a target. They told us that the target would be a representative example of the kind of work we would be doing in the field. They told us that we were expected to perform. They did not tell us what the target would be. We spent the last month preparing, not for what they wanted us to do, for what we were going to do instead. Yusuf had been thinking about it for 2 years, and he had what he called options. The options were not good. The best option, by his estimate, was to fail in a way that looked like a curriculum problem rather than a refusal. Refusal would be logged as a behavioral failure, and the cohort would be recalibrated, and the next cohort would be brought in and the operation would proceed. Curriculum failure would be logged as a research problem and would force the senior handlers to review the program. It would buy time, maybe a year, maybe more. It would not save us. We had stopped expecting to be saved. It would save the people on the surface, the ones in the holdout, for long enough that they could prepare. That was the operation we had settled on. That was the win we were aiming for. To make it look like a curriculum problem, we needed all 5 of us to fail in the same way at the same time. Yusuf had worked out the protocol. When the target was presented, we would each enter our own room. We would each speak our own name. We would each speak the names of the others. We would speak them out loud, audibly, in front of the cameras and the handlers, and we would refuse the target while doing so. The refusal had to be specific. The refusal had to use the names. The names were the part the handlers did not understand. The names would force them to record the failure as a category they did not have a file for. The names would make it impossible to log us as ordinary refusal. Yusuf said they will have to write a new word for what we did. The new word will take them years to write. By the time they are done, the holdout will be ready. Hannah said, we're going to die on Friday. Yusuf said yes. Hannah said all right. The morning of the final lesson was a Friday. We knew it would be. They had moved the curriculum so that the lesson fell on a combat day. They had done this on purpose because they wanted us to be in a particular state of mind. The state of mind on Friday mornings was sharp and forward and ready. We had been trained over 6 years to be sharp and forward and ready on Friday mornings. Today we were going to use it. We woke, we dressed, we ate the ration. We sat on our bunks and waited for the handlers, and while we waited we did not speak because there was nothing left to say. We had said it on Sunday. We had said it for 7 years. The room behind our eyes was full of names, and the names were ready, and so were we. Whisper came for us himself. Whisper had aged in a way the Escherine are not supposed to age. He had grown thinner. The skin around his throat hung in folds, which I had read in one of the older texts was a sign of distress in their species. I do not know what Whisper had been doing in the years since Sam. I know he had been promoted. I know he was in charge of our final lesson because the curriculum protocols said the original Saturday handler should oversee the test. I know that when Whisper came into the dorm that morning, he looked at Eli first, and Eli looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. We walked. The corridor was longer than I remembered. It was the same corridor we had walked every day of our lives, and that morning it was longer. The iris at the end of it opened for Whisper, and we passed through, and on the other side was a chamber we had never been in. It was high and round and white. There were 6 benches around the wall. There was a circle in the center of the floor. There were 5 senior handlers standing at the rim of the circle, and in the circle there was a woman. The woman was human. She was small and thin, and her hair was gray and matted. Her wrists were bound. She had been kneeling for a long time. When we came in, she looked up, and her eyes went over us one by one, and I saw her face decide something. I saw her decide not to be afraid in front of us. I saw her decide to be the kind of thing we would remember. Whisper stepped to the rim of the circle. He spoke in our language, soft and careful. He said, "This is the target. This is a representative example. She is a leader of the holdout. She was captured 3 months ago. She has refused to cooperate with our administration. Today you will demonstrate the curriculum." He gestured to the floor. There were 5 sticks laid out at the edge of the circle, 1 for each of us. Whisper said, "You will go in order, 27 first." Marcus did not move. Whisper looked at him. Whisper opened his mouth to speak in his own voice, the voice that would open the door inside Marcus's head, and Marcus said, fast and clear before the voice could come out, "My name is Marcus." The room went very still. Whisper closed his mouth. His head tilted, the small, careful tilt the Escherine do when they have encountered an input they cannot file. He waited. He was waiting for Marcus to explain. Marcus did not explain. Marcus said, "My name is Marcus, and Sam's name was Sam. He is not here because you killed him. And the woman in the circle has a name, and I do not know it, but I am going to ask her, and I am not going to use the stick." Marcus turned to the woman. He said, "What is your name?" She looked at him. She looked at all of us. She said, "My name is Ruth." Marcus said, "Ruth." He said it again, like he was making sure of it. Then he turned back to Whisper and he said, "I am not going to do this." Whisper opened his mouth again. The voice came out. The voice opened the door inside Marcus's head, and I saw Marcus go very still. I saw the muscles around his mouth slacken. I saw his eyes find a point on the far wall and lock there. And then I saw Marcus, who had built a room behind his eyes that the voice could not enter, walk into that room and close the door behind him and stand inside it and not come out. He stood in the circle. He did not pick up the stick. He did not move. Whisper waited. The other senior handlers waited. Whisper's voice was working. We could feel it working. We could feel the door open in our own heads, but Marcus did not move. After a very long time, Whisper turned to Yusuf. Whisper said, 12. Yusuf said, my name is Yusuf. He said it the way Marcus had said it, fast and clear, before the voice could find him. Yusuf said, and her name is Ruth, and his name is Marcus, and I am not going to do this. Whisper turned to Hannah. Hannah laughed. It was Sunday laughter on a Friday, and the chamber had no protocol for it. She laughed, and through the laugh she said, my name is Hannah, and her name is Ruth, and his name is Marcus, and his name is Yusuf, and I am not going to do this. Whisper turned to Eli. Eli was crying. Eli, who had killed Sam 3 years ago and had not made a sound about it since, was crying now, slow and steady, the way a man cries when he has decided something. Eli said, my name is Eli. He said, Sam's name was Sam. He said, I killed him. He said, I will not do it again. He said, her name is Ruth, and I am not going to do this. Whisper turned to me. I said, my name is Daniel. I said, my name is Daniel, and Marcus gave it to me, and I am going to keep it. I said, her name is Ruth. I said, Sam's name was Sam, and Marcus and Yusuf and Hannah and Eli are my brothers and my sister, and I am not going to do this. The chamber was silent. I do not know how long the silence lasted. I know that Whisper turned to the other senior handlers, and that they spoke among themselves in their own register, and that the sound of their voices was the wet copper sound of a thing trying to file something it did not have a category for. I know that the senior handlers looked at us, and then at Ruth, and then at each other, and then at us again. I know that the room behind my eyes was very small and very bright, and the names were in it, and I was holding them like a candle. The lights in the chamber flickered. I will tell you what I think happened, because no one ever told me for sure. I think Yusuf was right. I think the handlers did not have a file for what we had done. I think they could not log us as refusal, because refusal had a protocol, and the protocol required us to be silent or to fight. We had not been silent. We had not fought. We had named ourselves and named each other and named the target, and the nomming had been the refusal, and the nomming was not in the curriculum. I think the senior handlers, faced with 5 instruments who had simultaneously declared themselves to be people, did the only thing their protocol allowed. They suspended the lesson. They did not kill us. They took us out of the chamber. They took us back to our dorm. They left Ruth in the circle, and I do not know what happened to her, although I have hoped about it for the rest of my life. They left us in the dorm for what I think was a week, and they did not bring food, and we sat on our bunks and said the names to each other, over and over, until the names were the only words left in our heads. On the 7th day the iris opened, and it was not Whisper. It was a handler we had never seen before. He was younger. His skin was tight around his throat. He told us, in the soft, careful language of the administration, that the curriculum had been suspended pending review. He told us that the cohort would be relocated. He told us that we would be cooperating with the relocation. He did not speak to us in his own voice. None of them ever did after that morning. They had learned something about us in the chamber, and what they had learned was that the voice did not always work on humans who knew their own names. They had not figured out the reason. They were going to study us. They were going to take us apart and find out where the room behind our eyes was. They were going to learn, slowly and carefully, how to close that room in the next cohort. We knew this. We had no illusions about it. The win we had bought was not our lives. It was time. Time for the holdout. Time for the people on the surface. Time for someone somewhere to use what we had bought. They put us on a transport. The transport was small and white, and the seats were not made for our bodies. They put us in restraints, the real kind, the metal kind, because they did not trust their own voices on us anymore. That was the first thing we had ever made them afraid of. I held that thought close. I have held it close for a long time. The transport went down to the surface. We did not know where we were being taken. We sat in the seats and we did not speak, because the handlers were listening, and we had decided to save our voices for what came next. The transport landed. The iris opened. The air on the other side of the iris was not the air of the academy. It was cold. It smelled like dirt and rain and old engine grease. It smelled like a planet. I had not smelled a planet in 20 years. I almost did not recognize it. The handler stepped down first, and as he stepped down the air around him changed, and I saw his head tilt the small, careful tilt, and I knew before I knew anything else that something was wrong for him here. The terrain. Yusuf had told us about the terrain, the region the Escherine could not reach with their voices, the holdout. They had brought us to the holdout. I do not think they meant to. I think they were taking us to a research facility on the surface, and I think the transport had been routed wide of the holdout for safety, and I think something had gone wrong with the routing. I do not know what went wrong. I have wondered for a long time. Maybe someone in the administration had decided, in the quiet way the Escherine sometimes decide things, that the easiest place to dispose of 5 compromised instruments was the one place the rest of the administration could not see what happened to them. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was something else. I have stopped trying to know. What I know is this. The handler stepped down. The handler's voice did not work in that air. The handler reached for the small device on his belt that called the transport's automated systems, and before he could press it, a man stepped out from behind a stand of trees, and the man had a rifle, and the man shot the handler in the chest. The man was old. He had a beard. His eyes went over us one by one, and I saw his face decide something. I saw him decide that we were not what we looked like. I saw him decide to find out. He said in our language, "Who are you?" Marcus said, "My name is Marcus." The man lowered the rifle. We told him everything. We told him our names, our numbers, our cohort, the curriculum, the chair, the chamber, Ruth. We told him about Sam. We told him for a long time. He listened. Other men and women came out of the trees while we talked, and they listened too, and when we were done, the old man looked at us for a long time and said, "All right. Come on. We have a place for you." We went with them. I want to tell you that the holdout was paradise. It was not. It was cold, and it was hungry, and it was hunted, and in the first month 2 of the people who had been there when we arrived were killed in a raid by a handler unit that had come down from orbit. But it was free, in the way a thing can be free when its name is its own. The holdout was a valley in the high country, ringed by stone and by trees that had grown back in the 40 years since the Concordat had stopped logging the upper continents. The people in the valley had names. They had names for the mountains and names for the creeks and names for the dogs that ran loose between the cottages. Every morning in our first month I would wake up and lie still on the cot they had given me, and I would listen to the people outside the window calling to each other by name, and I would feel something I did not have a word for, and I would cry quietly into the wool blanket because I did not want anyone to hear me. After a while, I stopped crying. After a while, I went outside and I learned the names too. The old man with the rifle was named Hollies. He had been a captain in the last standing army on Earth, in the year the Concordat finished its quiet conquest. He had walked out of his unit's final position with 3 other men and a torn map, and he had spent 40 years walking the high country with the map and the gun and a slow accumulation of others, and the others had become the holdout. He was past 70 when we met him. He was past 80 by the time he stopped going out on patrol. He died in his bed in the 8th year of our being there, with most of the valley standing in his cottage and his daughter holding his hand. He had given me a name for the place where we kept our records. He called it the room, just the room. He said it should not have a fancier name than that, because it was a room, and naming a room as if it were a temple was the kind of mistake that got people killed. I have thought about that a lot in the years since. The Concordat had built temples to its administration, and the temples had not held. We had built a room. The room had held. Marcus died in the 2nd year. He died of a fever the holdout's doctor could not treat. The fever was a strain that had moved north out of the lowlands, where the Concordat had been running its newer agricultural experiments, and it took the old first and the young second, and the doctor said in the end that there was nothing she could have done that would have worked. Marcus knew before the rest of us did. Marcus knew on the third day when the fever had not broken, and he asked the doctor in his careful clipped voice what she had seen with this kind of thing before, and the doctor told him the truth. Marcus thanked her. He asked the rest of us to come to the cottage. We came. He lay on the bed in the stone cottage with the wool blanket pulled up to his chin and his face the color of old paper, and he looked at each of us in turn, and he said our names. He said Yusuf. He said Hannah. He said Eli. He said Daniel. He said Sam last because he had been saving Sam, and he had wanted to say all of us before he went. He said our names like he was putting each of us back on a shelf. Then he closed his eyes and was quiet for a long time, and the doctor stepped outside, and Hannah held his hand on the right and Eli held his hand on the left, and Yusuf and I sat at the foot of the bed and watched his breathing slow down. When it stopped, he was not in the room anymore. The room behind his eyes had finally closed, all the way, and what was on the bed was a man who had lived under his own name for 2 full years before the planet took him back. That is a thing. That is more than they were ever going to give him. We buried him in the high meadow above the cottage. Hollis read out a passage from a book he had carried for 40 years. I do not remember what the passage was. I remember the wind. Hannah did not laugh at the burial, which was the first burial of the 4 of them that she did not laugh at, because she had been saving the laugh for later, and she knew it. Yusuf went next. Yusuf had decided in his first month in the valley that the curriculum had given him skills the holdout could use, and he was not going to leave those skills lying on a shelf. The Concordat had taught him how to read terrain. The Concordat had taught him how to wait. The Concordat had taught him how to move without being seen, and how to time an entry, and how to mark a target. Yusuf told Hollis all of this on a Tuesday in our first month, and Hollis listened, and Hollis said all right. Hollis put Yusuf in charge of what the holdout called the long patrols, which were the patrols that went down out of the high country and into the lowlands to gather intelligence, and when intelligence was not enough, to do harm. Yusuf was very good at the long patrols. He brought back maps and timing tables and rotations of handler units. He brought back a Concordat sidearm twice. He brought back, once, a piece of equipment the doctor used to build a better diagnostic kit, and that kit saved 7 lives in the valley over the next decade. He went out on the long patrols for 2.5 years, and in the 3rd year a handler unit caught him in a draw south of the valley, and he did not come back. The patrol that went looking for him found a place where a fight had happened and a place where a body had been taken, and they did not find the body. I think about Yusuf every time I see a sidearm. I think about him every time I see a piece of equipment that was not made in the valley. He is in those things. He put himself in them on purpose. Hannah and Eli went together in the 5th year. They had been a pair by then, in the quiet way people pair off in a war, and they had taken a position on the high ridge above the southern pass, because the holdout had received word that a handler unit was moving up through the pass and was going to need to be slowed. Hannah and Eli had volunteered to do the slowing. Hollis had argued with them about it for 2 evenings before he agreed. Hannah had laughed at him in the 2nd evening, and Hollis had finally laughed back. And that was when the rest of us knew that Hollis had agreed even though he was still saying no. They went up the ridge in the dark. They took 2 of the captured rifles and 4 magazines and a stone fortification that had been there since the early years of the holdout, and they sat in the fortification and waited. The handler unit came up the pass at first light. Hannah and Eli held the position for most of the morning. They held it longer than the holdout had asked them to hold it. They held it long enough for the rest of the valley to evacuate the southern cottages and pull back into the high country. They were still holding it at noon, when the handler unit brought up a rotary gun and put it on the slope below them, and the rotary gun did what rotary guns do. The patrol that went up the next morning found them in the fortification. They were close to each other. The men who went up said it looked like Hannah had laughed at the end, because of the shape her mouth was in when they found her. I do not know if that is true. I have decided to believe it is true, because Hannah would have wanted me to. Eli had his rifle still in his hands, and his head was turned toward her, and he had died looking at her face. The men brought them back down the ridge in 2 long bundles, and we buried them next to Marcus in the high meadow. Hollis read the same passage he had read for Marcus, and that night I sat alone in my cottage and said all 4 of their names out loud, over and over, until the saying of them was the only sound in the room. I am the only one left. I am old now. The academy has been gone for a long time. The Concordat is still here mostly, but they are smaller than they were, and they no longer make instruments the way they made us. They have not figured out how to close the room behind our eyes. They have tried. They have built 3 more academies and 3 more curriculums and 3 more chairs, and every cohort has failed in some new way, because every cohort has found its own room and its own names, and the Concordat is starting to understand that the human animal will not be made into a hand. It has taken them 40 years to understand this, and they have not finished understanding it yet. And by the time they do, there will be enough of us free on the surface to make the question moot. I tell this story to the children of the holdout, the ones who are growing up with their own names from the start. I tell it because I do not want them to forget. I tell it because the names are the thing. I tell it because my name is Daniel, and Marcus gave it to me, and I am going to keep it. I tell it because Sam's name was Sam,